Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce both of our guests today. We've got Kevin Wright, who's the executive director of the Walnut Hills Redevelopment Foundation, and Joe Nickol, who's an urban designer with MKSK Studios, and they're both co-authors of what they're terming the Neighborhood Playbook. Can you tell us a bit about what that playbook is?
Sure. The playbook is an idea that kind of grew out of Kevin and I's individual and joint working experience in working in communities in the Midwest and really across the country. And it really started as a conversation about what we were seeing happening in community development. You know, we've got a market now that's much more accustomed and interested in moving back into cities, back into neighborhoods. And that's kind of uncovering or exposing all sorts of interesting opportunities, challenges. And what we saw happen was, or as happening was, a great disparity between the so-called hot neighborhoods and all the other kind of places that make our cities interesting. And that in both cases, the hot neighborhoods as well as the neighborhoods that are kind of been written off or off the map, that there was a lot of challenges kind of with the development community working with the kind of community that's always been there. And, you know, one results from growth pressures and things exploding, and others from kind of lack of attention and exposure. So we started just kind of sharing our observations with one another and in our, you know, in our professional circles, and started thinking that we should kind of encapsulate the strategies and things we've seen and explored and tinkered with on our own, and created an article called 5 Ways to Activate Your Neighborhood This Weekend, really as a way to inspire folks who live in a neighborhood to kind of take more of a control of their own destiny. That was just a small little thought piece that really just formalized the notes that we had been taking, but it got a lot of attention in kind of on the internet and that kind of thing. And so we started thinking about it further and had discussions with a group called People's Liberty, who have been sponsoring individual projects for community betterment and investment for several years in Cincinnati, and started kind of thinking there's not really a field guide that helps developers or communities kind of work through innovative, inclusive, exciting neighborhood development. And so People's Liberty agreed to underwrite a project to create that field guide. And starting in, when was it? At the beginning of 2016, we began drafting and building this document, this tool for people to come together around creative neighborhood development. In the fall of 2016, with the help of People's Liberty, our partners, BLDG, who helped with the design and positioning of it, we released in October the Neighborhood Playbook, both online and in print. And since that time, have been really inspired and excited to see the adoption of it and incorporation of it into a lot of different initiatives locally in the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area, but also nationally, with people expressing interest, purchasing the book, tinkering with it around the country and in Canada. And so it's been really exciting to see it in its early stages.
So I'm really intrigued by this perspective that you guys bring to bear in terms of, I think if I remember rightly, that there's one way you can read the book if you're a developer, and there's another way you can read the book if you're kind of a community member. Those two often come into conflict with one another, and I'm sure you guys have seen that in your travels. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the role that you think they both play and how they need to work together.
Right, and you mentioned the design of the book, which took quite a bit of effort and the creative talent of our partner BLDG, and just a lot of minds at the table to figure out how to make it work. We wanted it to be built as Joe said, a field guide, something that you have to own it in print so you can take notes in it, tear it up a little bit, shove it in your back pocket. In some ways we called it the playbook because we're really the coach. And if you're holding the book, your neighborhood is contextually different than other neighborhoods, so you have to be somewhat flexible while using it. And the audience was always twofold. It was a community member. In our mind, it was a community member who is frustrated with the direction of their neighborhood in some specific way. You know, I want my neighborhood to be more walkable. I want this sort of type of retail or public space. And then we also saw an opportunity in the development world. As Joe mentioned, starting out here, he said, you know, the urban market is proven. So people are making money developing in the urban market, and there are a lot of neighborhoods that are still undeveloped. And the entrepreneurial developer, smaller developer, is trying to crack into neighborhoods first, but there's a lot of risk involved in that. And so how could we help that type of developer come in and do sort of a small-scale development in an emerging neighborhood? And you are right that, you know, in my world, I work at a CDC, the world of community and the world of development tend to butt heads. They tend to both be afraid of one another. Developers fear community because they're fearful that working with a community can halt the project or slow a project or cost them money. And then communities tend to have a fear of displacement, but also a fear of bad development. So what is it going to look like? What is it going to feel like? Is it going to be good architecture, good design? So the book was designed twofold. So if you are a developer, you can enter through one side and go through the process of the 5 plays in the playbook. The plays are the same on the other side, which is for the community. But it is written and designed intentionally for a different audience. And then the book is a Z-fold design, and in the middle, when you get to the end, as the developer of the community, you can peer through a window, literally a window in the book, and it says, you know, you should really flip this book over and read it from the other person's point of view. And so that way, we jokingly call it an empathy tool. So hopefully it helps to build empathy between the two sides. Because one of my biggest worries in urban growth moving forward is that a fear of what development can bring is stopping us before we even start. And when we talk about solving sort of some of the comprehensive issues around poverty and other issues, we really can't begin to solve those issues if our neighborhoods aren't growing, if people aren't moving back in, if jobs aren't coming back in. And so neighborhoods that are stagnant really worry me, and I hope this is a tool that can help get them moving.
That's interesting. You obviously, I think, here pointing out that, you know, some of your work with the Community Development Corporation, that's coming from grants from different places. I imagine you're getting some city money as well as some federal money in there. And so there's a specific governmental focus to some degree in that. And also as a nonprofit, I imagine you have a bit of a different relationship with the community, but you also seem to, you know, there's a very real sense here that private development is important. And I think that, you know, if you go back to the roots of CityWorks, that's something that our founder, Ed Walker, certainly believes. But it's not something that I think is universally accepted by those people that are living in these communities that need that kind of investment. What do you kind of say when you go into a community and the immediate reaction is, if you're a developer, we don't want to hear what you have to say?
That's a good question. I think I actually would push back on that question a bit. From my experience, I think that what you just asked is what developers are fearful of. They're fearful of walking into a room and the room saying, "We don't want you here." That, from my experience, rarely is the case. But that is often that fear of that happening stops development and growth before it starts. What tends to happen if the developer can get in the room with the community and truly listen is they might say a lot of things that scare the developer. I want this big thing that the developer might be thinking, well, the market will never demand that. I can't afford to build that. But there are things to pull out of conversations like that can happen within a development. And what you can end up with is a project that gets approved and has a little bit of both worlds in it. And, you know, from a nonprofit CDC standpoint, I always say that we're the middleman. kind of between everybody. Our job is to take the vision of the community, match it up with what is buildable in the market now, go out and find a private developer and ask them, will they build it? They tend to say, well, we'll build it, but we need X, Y, and Z. And then going over to the public sector, whether it's the city or the foundation sector, to find the funding that then can help that make it a reality. So it tends to always be a compromise on all sides as an end result. But I think, although in many communities, in many markets, many neighborhoods that frankly should be growing when you look at their infrastructure and their location, aren't, because of that fear of even having that initial conversation. And we have found that sometimes, many times, that it doesn't always have to be a conversation in a church basement or in a rec center. It can be an event. It can be a beer garden. It can be, the community and the development community and the actual community coming together and having a party and connecting with one another and learning by showing up. And that's really a big part of the Playbook's methodology.
Well, it sounds to me, I think this is a common refrain that I often push when I'm in this situation, so I may be projecting this, but it sounds to me like really what you guys are pushing to some degree with this is a certain level of humility, that when developers go in, but they need to have a humility about what is right for that community, but also community members need to know that they don't have all the answers either.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, what we've recognized is that over the last 50 or 60 years, fundamental flaws have entered into our planning and development process, where we value engineered out a lot of the kind of human demand discovery that used to naturally occur as part of the building of our great neighborhoods and cities. And so today, for instance, it's common to get into that church basement or into that meeting and talk hypothetically, very high level, about the plan and vision for the future. And then what happens usually is, in the best case scenario, is everybody goes away, and the people who are kind of given the title of implementers go behind the scenes and start doing the hard work of making that plan a reality. Well, that's great, except if you're in the community, either as a developer or as a community member, you end up seeing very little happening. And that leads to fear, frustration, and what have you. And, best case scenario, 2-3 years go by, and then the first development deal comes down the pipe. And we're really infatuated with the project, with the big catalyst that we all want to see at the end of the day. But the reality is that's a scary proposition. And when I don't get to interact with that change until the construction fence goes up and the hole goes in the ground and new stuff starts popping up, that's a challenge. And so what we've noticed is that we've missed this middle ground that used to happen in our cities, where we'd set a course, but then we'd allow some organic growth of the neighborhood to occur to discover where the possibilities are. And we call these two steps activation and then smart, small development. And that's really what the playbook is meant to help communities and developers deliver. On one hand, the activation is discovering the demand. If the plan says we need a coffee shop, there are ways we can test the demand for that coffee shop before we raise, $800,000 to build out a space for one. We can do pop-ups, we can do events around coffee. We can show the development community that there is a pure, real demand for that type of use. And then as you structure those events in a kind of deliberate way, then you get to start tying that to small amenity building investments in making that coffee shop go from pop-up to permanent. Kevin's working in a neighborhood where that same trajectory worked for a place that really wanted restaurants. And so a pop-up pizza oven shows up to these events that activated this small little courtyard. And over the course of 2 years, that led to that pizza truck acquiring and developing a small building that they now inhabit. And then that becomes the common amenity that leverages larger investment that wants to be around it. So that development side of the age-old process still happens, but it gets much better once you test the demand, build small amenities and outcomes and wins from that demand testing, and then lead into the bigger, more challenging work ahead.
And it's really interesting because that activation does so much more than just demand generation in some ways, that it's also, it's how you develop social capital, I think, in many ways. And it's so I think that activation for me gets to so many of the different aspects of this space that we want to show. And this is, I had never really thought of this demand side of it, and I appreciate you guys bringing that out.
Yeah, the spinoff from it is immense. And as you mentioned, the kind of capital across any number of areas grows and the relationships grow. And that, if you're an investor, a developer, or a retailer, or what have you, you can interact with the community in a totally less hostile way than a community association meeting or city council hearing or something like that, which is the traditional venue for that kind of interaction. Suddenly you're in an opportunity to be ingrained as part of the community and learn what makes it unique and tick, and let it influence and shape how you think about investing in a place.
Well, it's intriguing to me that you guys, you mentioned that you live in Bellevue before we came on the air, which I think is a really interesting place, having spent some time there. But you guys have also done work throughout that Cincinnati area, if I'm not mistaken. And so how have you guys kind of managed to contextualize your work when you're working in communities that you're less familiar with or that are less like you in many ways?
Right, and I was going to kind of bring it back to that, because the outcomes around this demand discovery and activation for inclusion are really interesting to me and kind of endless in many ways. And it kind of goes back to that question of are some communities anti-development, completely anti-development? And the reason I know on that is because when you go into communities, let's say, of large African-American populations who have every reason to be fearful of development, when you talk to those neighborhoods, you hear that they want growth, they want less vacant buildings. It seems obvious, but it needs to be said out loud. They want less vacant buildings, they want better schools, they want better transit. They have a fear of being displaced by that. And so the really interesting aspect of this activation demand discovery phase that we've discovered, for lack of a better term, and that we're starting to insert into the revitalization process, is that if you're an African American or Latino or some representative of a minority population, but you're in a neighborhood where it's the majority population, and you are the one who develops the goals and the outcomes and the activation strategies, it will inherently sort of begin to look like you. And the demand will be shaped based on who you are. And then the outcome will hopefully be attached to who you are. So Joe kind of mentioned Walnut Hills example, which was this firehouse, this pizza place, which went into an old firehouse. And their experience with the neighborhood as is what made them want to do the firehouse. They weren't sold on a vision 5 years from now. They liked the diversity and the vibe of the neighborhood now, which influenced the design of their restaurant, which is very inclusive. And now that Walnut Hills is growing, and there are concerns about gentrification, there are meetings held at that restaurant to talk about the concerns around gentrification, which is kind of funny and ironic in a way, because they're sitting inside a development talking about concerns about development, which means to some extent that it doesn't feel like development. So that's one of those positive aspects of starting small. Over in the Bellevue side, what we learned was that there's similar fears, that it's largely sort of a Kentucky audience. A lot of people have lived in their homes for generations there, a working class neighborhood who doesn't necessarily want to become Fort Thomas, which is a neighborhood we talked about offline, right up the hill, which is very expensive. And so the programming and activation that happened around a vacant building in Bellevue was very Kentucky proud. So the event was called the Old Kentucky Makers Market. And they said, hey, we don't want to run away from our Kentucky brand. We want to embrace everything great about Kentucky. We don't want to be what Joe and I refer to jokingly as Ohio light, which is oftentimes what Northern Kentucky ends up being. They kind of apologize for being Kentucky. But we're close to Cincinnati. We're kind of like Cincinnati, but these folks wanted to be, straight up Kentucky. They wanted to embrace that brand and draw in retailers who respected that. And so we're starting to see that happen there. So I think that attempts to answer your question of sort of authentically going into a place and respecting what it is and selling that, branding that, telling that story, which frankly makes them more valuable because it's unique to them. And we've really seen that work. And a couple of other examples in Walnut Hills, our next development was a $10 million development with 5 retail bays, and 3 of the 5 retail bays are going to be African American business owners. And so, again, sort of telling that story of we're an African American neighborhood, we're a diverse neighborhood from the get-go, and proving it out through this demand discovery work has helped us implement a reality in the supply side.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for mega regions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. I'm really intrigued in terms of, I think that, with some familiarity with y'all's neck of the woods, that Walnut Hills, I think you guys are in this place that's close enough to downtown that there are a lot of reasons why people would want to live there. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Newport's gone through something of a renaissance in the past few years, and I think that from an outside perspective, I look at that and think there are a lot of amenities that are in those places already, and that there's a clear reason why someone would want to invest in these places, even though they've seen years and years of no investment, that now that makes a certain amount of sense. But how do you kind of build that demand in neighborhoods that are harder to kind of realize what it is that investors can see, or where the natural amenities come into play?
No, it's a tough question because I think, as you mentioned on the outset, or we discussed in the outset, that we find ourselves working in one of two kinds of contexts. One where it's so hot and change is so rapid that we need to evolve how we deal with change and how we shape change. But the other side of the coin are the neighborhoods that for so long have been left out of the conversation. And even if they're locationally appropriate and ripe for increased investment, for whatever reason, investment does not come. And so in the case of Walnut Hills, for instance, while it was very downtown near and was a historic neighborhood and played a prominent role in the city of Cincinnati's growth at one time, it struggled for a very long time with disinvestment, despite the fact it was right next to our two largest job centers. And so it wasn't easy by any means. And a lot of conventional planning tools and strategies had been employed over decades with very little effect. And it wasn't until the conversation changed about how we were going to go after positive outcomes and change in the neighborhood did a corner actually get turned. Back to your question, how do you deal with places that don't enjoy Walnut Hills kind of locational advantages, or kind of, in retrospect, the kind of intuitive logic to why they would develop? We always get asked when we're speaking on this, so can you do this to my dying shopping mall, or a neck of the woods that nobody even travels to or from or through because they have no reason to. And the reality is, it's tough to give a blanket answer about that because, as Kevin mentioned, every situation is so different. But what the playbook tries to do is bring the conversation down to a scale where people aren't drowning in the weight of change necessary to make positive impact on the places that they live. We're very sensitive to scale of project, for instance. And so that when we talk about activating the space, we're not trying to activate 20 acres of vacant parking lot or a field that used to be an industrial building that got flattened or something. We're trying to find the intimate, special places that feel like outdoor rooms. Or when we talk about how to kind of get your story out there and tell your story, we're not reliant on taking it out on the newspaper or showing putting a banner up along a fence somewhere. We're using all the tools that we have today to sponsor a conversation that's authentically rooted in that place. And it's amazing how simple things like social media and the internet, once considered novel or non-traditional marketing and storytelling strategies, have become ingrained into how we talk about place. And so using that as a way to drive it home. And then, the whole idea that so much of what makes places special on a temporary basis around events and that kind of thing is mobile and able to travel. You have the ability to kind of set the stage, as it were, around the special qualities of a place in ways that we haven't had the ability to in the recent past. And so, on one hand, you're kind of uncovering what's already magical or special about a place, and then on the other hand, augmenting it with all the tools that you now have at your disposal. And what the playbook really tries to do is tie those two together in a strategy that's organized enough to make it clear what the steps are and how to do it, but flexible enough so you can tailor it to those situations that are both logical or, on the other hand, weird and insane.
Well, I imagine that there's a part of this for you all that really one of the goals for something like this is to get more people involved in this, that once they walk through the playbook that one time and see kind of how easy it is and how rewarding it is to do this kind of work, that they're going to then move on to something a little more ambitious or just become involved in a way they weren't before. Is that something that you guys have seen happen?
Yeah, this is one of the things that's really exciting for me as a kind of quote unquote professional in the industry. Over the last 100 years, the building industry, the city building, neighborhood building industry has become very professionalized. When in reality, like historically, our best, oldest neighborhoods and cities were built by just great craftsmen and designers and people who were just out there doing great work. Now there's this prevailing attitude that if I live in a neighborhood, that it's somebody's job to make it better and to manage it and to invest in it, and that I can play a passive role in that. What the playbook tries to do is really democratize the process. Kevin mentioned the Bellevue, Kentucky example. We put the playbook in the hands of 5 unsuspecting folks who had no background in neighborhood development. And they were able to use the methodologies in the playbook to become experts in their own place. Now, as we're entering the second year of this effort with them, they are the kind of declared leaders of that space in Bellevue. And like I said, none of them started with that kind of professional training or background. So to answer your question, I think that can and must happen for us to be successful. It can't just be left to the people who got trained up for 10 years in school and have been doing it for 20 or 30 years. They have a role still for sure, but the stage is a much bigger one than that now.
Well, and also I'll just add to that there's the social capital side of it, which is obviously really intriguing to us. The other side of it is that's really exciting is making neighborhood development and revitalization smarter. And oftentimes, not to pick on the professionals, because Joe and I are in that field, but a neighborhood resident will say, and there are probably people listening to this podcast who experience this, will say, I really want a restaurant in that building or on that street, or I want a coffee shop. And someone who they're talking to will say, oh, well, that no one would ever go there. What a professional would probably say is, oh, well, there's not enough residential density to support that. And so what happens is in the traditional planning and development process is we do a plan, as Joe mentioned earlier, and then we say, okay, we need to revitalize the business district, right? And so the answer then becomes, let's acquire 2 to 3 acres of land. Let's demolish a lot of historic buildings because those are expensive. And let's heavily subsidize a large catalytic development, and that'll bring the rooftops and the residential into the neighborhood to support future retail. When as a neighborhood resident, you're like, man, I just wanted a coffee shop. And so this is, in a way, this new model that we've been talking about all over the country, it flips that on its head, where traditionally we've said retail follows rooftops. We're actually thinking, well, what if that's the opposite? What if rooftops follow retail? And this proven urban market that has emerged in the last decade has shown us that if I'm renting an apartment or buying a condo or buying a house, I'm doing it in a neighborhood that already has at least a couple of amenities because I want to be in a walkable neighborhood. I'm not buying or renting on the basis of future amenities. I want to buy or rent in a neighborhood where I have at least a coffee shop or a bar to walk to. And so the playbook allows you to prove some of those people wrong, which is part of how I discovered it. Because of that old firehouse where the neighborhood said, Kevin, I really want a restaurant in that firehouse. The professionals told me that would never happen. Some people said tear it down. Some people said just put an office in there. And what the activation allowed us to do was to actually prove that if we build it, they will come. And to see who that audience was, as opposed to just heavily subsidizing a bunch of residential before even trying. So there's a couple of sides of this that are really interesting, which is one, the social capital side. You help us build it, help the professionals build it. And the other side, which is just that firehouse opening in Walnut Hills, has made every other development after it so much smarter and more intelligent up to what the neighborhood is and who's there and where the spending power is.
It's so fascinating. What really comes to me is that there's this sense of there's a greater wisdom than just the professionals, that everyone has a bit of knowledge that they can bring to the table. And when we all come to the table, then we're so much stronger than if we just listen to one side or the other in this conversation.
Right.
Well, you guys have been all over the country kind of talking about these issues and engaging with these questions. And I wonder, like, when you go into a new community, what are the things that you look for? What are the things that make you think that this is a community that's growing or a place that's got something going on?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that the answer is a little different from every place that we go. We love, whenever we land in a place, we spend as little time as possible indoors, and we spend a lot of time, walking or pedaling around places. And if it feels even mildly comfortable to do either of those two activities, that's a pretty good starting point. Oftentimes we're asked to work in places where they don't even have that it's too dangerous or too far or just otherwise too difficult to get there from here, or when I'm there to get around in there. So walkability and the elements of like bikeability are important. Buildings are important. Scorched earth areas, the playbook works in that, but you have to try and work much harder in an area that does not have building stock. And by building stock, I mean historic buildings, but even kind of the Flotsam and Jetsam that kind of has been built over the last 50 years, the gas stations, the small retail centers, the mechanic garages, the carriage units on the alleys themselves. The buildings and the spaces that they create along the streets or in between buildings or behind buildings create those kind of special rooms that allow you to kind of have a sense of discovery as you and exploration and excitement as you walk or move through a neighborhood. Natural features are really important, and they don't have to be much. A 1 or 2 or 3 tree canopied area around like a 5,000 square foot patch of dirt or grass can create a similar effect to a space defined by buildings. A creek front, a rock outcrop. I mean, there's all sorts of natural features that help augment what the buildings can do and create a really special outdoor environment. We're really looking for spaces that can be activated, that can feel full. By that I mean that can feel full, whether they have 50 people in them or 500 people in them. And if you can find that little jewel, that little space in a neighborhood, and as you look out from that space or around that space, there are some clear early wins in kind of these older buildings that nobody has really quite figured out how or what to do with them. That's a really good spot to start. Absent too many of those things, it just becomes more difficult. I'm pretty optimistic in saying that this can work almost anywhere. But like I said before, the lift in doing that and what you have to create and build just becomes much more of a task.
That idea of finding a place to be activated, that's a really compelling vision, and it's something that, so one of the things that we've done here in Roanoke that kind of got me started in this path is to do a soup event kind of modeled off of what happened in Detroit that I'm sure you all are familiar with. And finding the right venue for that made all the difference in terms of making it work. And it really speaks to me that I think that was something we were looking for that we couldn't articulate in quite that same way that you just did. So I really appreciate that perspective.
And those are just the physical attributes. I mean, you can't discount the human and people aspect as well. It takes hardworking, creative people to do this, and it takes a team and a family really to pull something like this off. And so part of our discovery process is we're launching on any kind of initiative like this. Before we even put pen to paper, we're trying to build out that team with people who know and are passionate about that place and have, a connection to it that adds a lot of value to kind of building out these ideas.
And then one of the plays in the book is finding a space to activate, and that was one of the more difficult ones to write. I think one of the reasons Joe can articulate it so well is because we spent so many hours trying to put pen to paper on what makes a good space. And in simple terms, it really just comes down to don't pick a giant field, which I think tends to be the inclination of neighborhood groups that, because neighborhood groups pretty consistently across the board do events every year, usually like an annual festival. So your inclination is to say, let's pick a giant green space or let's close a street. What we have found is that if the space is a little intimate, discovery-driven, tucked away, that it works much better. It needs to feel full. If there's 100 people there, it needs to feel full. It needs to feel tight. It's counterintuitive, but not on the main drag, maybe behind the main drag that you're trying to activate or trying to redevelop. That tends to scare people. Why would we hide the events? Well, there's a lot of reasons to hide the events, depending on the space. And we are pushed back on that a lot. No, we should put it right where everyone can see it on the main drag. Well, I mean, that's what everybody does. What is unique about your space that maybe you can't find in the adjacent neighborhood or some other neighborhood in the city? So that was a really important part of the process of the book.
But it's that's so compelling, and I think that's really fascinating. We found that our venue was right on what I think a lot of folks in town would term the wrong side of the railroad tracks, but it was close enough that it wasn't too intimidating to go over there, but it was also, I think there was a statement made by us encouraging people to go into that neighborhood, and it's a really interesting balancing act to go down. But I think the point about the people is absolutely true as well. I know that every time I go to the mall here in Roanoke, I'm like, why do I not see these people anywhere other than at the mall? And I'm sure you guys see whatever that monstrosity is down in Newport by the river. where the IMAX is and everything. And you go in there and you're like, what do we have to do to get these people activated and get them engaged in this kind of community-driven work? That I think that for me is one of the most interesting challenges of this entire discussion.
Yeah, I mean, what we're finding, and you hit the nail on the head when you talked about how social capital develops as a kind of externality to the activation efforts. But you host these kind of curated events, and the people that come together are people that on a normal everyday basis would have no reason or even the ability to interact. And it builds a kind of camaraderie and connection just between people in a community who may live down the street from each other but have never found the reason to talk to each other. That's one layer. But the next layer goes back to how this model is getting repaired through this new process. And that is, if you participated in the early activation work, and over time development and investment starts to happen around it, or it even replaces the space in which you used to come to, you have a fundamentally different relationship and connection to the investment that's happening in a place. So that whether you're at the top of the pay scale in a neighborhood or just struggling to get by, whether you've lived there for 100 years in multiple generations or you've been there for a few months, you walk by these places that you're connected to. And as they're incrementally evolving and changing, you can say honestly that not only do I remember what this used to be, and these are the memories and that I can associate with that, but that I was actually part of that change. And that is different than doing a plan in the basement, going away for 18 to 24 months, and hoping that the compromise that comes out at the other end is something that you identify with. And so that's one thing that we're really hoping people take away from this, whether you're an investor, development, entrepreneur type, or just a community member who wants a cooler place to live, that the new model that we're championing here can fundamentally advance both those causes.
Let me just say that resonates with me personally, and so I think that's an incredible articulation there. Now, I think I've kept you guys far too long already this morning, but I wonder if you guys could kind of wrap us up with a story that you think demonstrates what a community looks like when it's working well, or something that's kind of taught you a lot along the way, just something that you kind of think ties together the stuff that you've talked about.
Well, the easy one for me, and this is probably a story that both of us can talk about, Joe is involved as well, is the Walnut Hills story. My background was in journalism before urban planning, and right out of grad school for urban planning, experience, I landed this job as an executive director of this CDC in Walnut Hills. My job was to revitalize the main commercial corridor, which used to be known as the city's second downtown. Major undertaking. Had been one of the more blighted streets, and had some of the highest crime rates of any street in the city over the last few decades. So you can kind of put yourself in my shoes and imagine the task in front of me. What we did was we had on one hand, on our left side, the community saying we want restaurants and vibrancy. And on the right side, the market, the developers, the professionals saying you should really do a low-income housing tax credit deal. You can't fill all this retail, et cetera. We're now at a point, 4.5 years later, 5 years later, where we're probably the emerging neighborhood in Cincinnati, attracting some of the best restaurants and retailers in the city. And what we did was we discovered these 5 alleyways, and they were part of the safety problem. There was a lot of crime happening there, and they were behind the main drag. And they created an intersection that was really a unique space. And we did what all neighborhoods do. We said, well, let's do a cleanup. But then we said, let's just crack open a keg of beer on the next day and invite the volunteers back to enjoy the space that they helped clean up. We, called those the 5 Points pop-up beer gardens. And we had a little bit of music and a food truck. those exploded into hundreds of people from all over the city kind of coming. And then also an untapped market in the neighborhood that had disposable income that we didn't even really know was there. And that just kind of changed the momentum of the neighborhood. And so we really needed that demand indicator to then get investors to pay more attention. Well, as that went on, the majority of the attendees at these beer gardens were young, white professionals. And so a lot of the people in the neighborhood, the leadership in the neighborhood, the African-American leadership in particular, said, hey, who is this for? What is happening? What is this going to lead to? What kind of change is this going to look like our neighborhood? And we were able to make adjustments throughout the process to adapt to the concerns that we were hearing. And so we did art projects in the alleys that reflected the diversity of the neighborhood. And we did, we outsourced some of the programming to African-American professional groups and nonprofits. We dropped the beer gardens and just tried to tap into a whole new different demographic. And we could do that because the momentum had already shifted. Walnut Hills was growing, investors were interested, and now it was a different outcome. It was, okay, well, let's make sure this investment looks like us. And so that, to me, is a story that can be applied anywhere, but that can never happen in the traditional planning process that Joe and I talked about. That cannot happen in a planning process where you invite people into a library or rec center and have them put dots on a map, and then you just go away and build something. So before we had ever built anything, we were hearing concerns about gentrification. We were able to make adjustments, and then when we did build something, it was more reflective of what we had heard.
Well, it's just such a strong story, and I think your results speak for themselves, and so I think it's such a compelling narrative to kind of close things out on. But thank you guys so much for taking the time. For those of you all listening, we had the pleasure of having Kevin come speak at CityWorks a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, Joe couldn't make it then, but if you want to hear Kevin's talk, you can hear it on our website, cityworksexpo.com. But thank you guys so much for taking the time this morning. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brad. And I don't know if we mentioned it just for your listeners, though, if they want to learn more about the playbook, neighborhoodplaybook.com has the story, has an outline of the plays, as well as some other resources, as well as how to acquire the book. So I appreciate it and everything you guys do at CityWorks. And look forward to keeping the conversation going with you guys.
Well, good deal. Absolutely. Check it out, folks. It's a great resource. And as you can tell, we don't have all the answers, but they have a good way to start here for you. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the day for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. And keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.